Hello, and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores the big ideas and policies shaping our world. My name is Tom Speth.
I'm Lily Mott.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the sudden appearance of St. George flags popping up across England, Reform's recent party conference in Birmingham, and the recent resignation of Angela Rayner, subsequent cabinet reshuffle, and the sacking of UK's ambassador to the United States, Peter Mandelson.
It's certainly been a busy couple of weeks in British politics, so let's start with you, Tom. Could you tell us a little bit more about what's going on with these British and English flags appearing out of nowhere and being all over the news? I've seen lots about it, but I'd love to know more about the history.
Yeah, so it's a really something quite strange has sort of been unfolding across England this summer, and it's also bled into other parts of the UK as well, and that's the sudden proliferation of St. George's flags. So these are red and white crosses, which are now ubiquitous sight, appearing on lampposts and road markings and attached to motorway bridges. It's a display that some see as a powerful sign of patriotism and pride, while others believe it might be more a provocative act, which many, particularly migrant and immigrant communities, find unsettling. The debate has become sort of a physical, visual manifestation of a wider sort of culture wars in Britain, raising questions about national identity and who gets to define patriotism and what it is to be English and what it is to be British as well. St. George is the patron saint of England. This might be a sort of unfamiliar concept to people outside of the UK. There are 4 patron saints of the UK: St. Andrew for Scotland, St. Patrick for Northern Ireland, and also for the Republic of Ireland, St. David, who is obviously the best patron saint for Wales, and St. George for England. They'll all have celebration days. St. George's Day takes place on the 23rd of April. Some of the days are also national bank holidays. So in Scotland, and I think I'm not sure in Northern Ireland, but in the Republic of Ireland, it's a bank holiday. And there's often discussions about whether the other days should be as well. And a good example of how that sort of manifests. So when I was at primary school, I remember being asked by my school teacher to draw a picture of St. George on St. George's Day. I attended a Church of England school in a very little village on the outskirts of Dover called Temple Ewell. Temple Ewell was named after the Knights Templar, the order of knights who fought the Crusades in modern-day Israel and Palestine. And the legend of St. George is one of a noble knight defeating a dragon. And what little kid doesn't like the idea of a knight fighting a dragon? It's very sort of Game of Thrones. So I drew and coloured in a picture of St. George. Little did I know the historical context of the flag. And I think that's sort of part of the problem here, is that a lot of people seem to be mixing their histories up, and perhaps people that are flying them don't really recognise the importance or the significance of the flags that they're raising beyond the idea of patriotism or love of country or whatever way you want to put it. So in terms of sort of the history of our flags, if we circle back to now, that flags have been going up across England, have thought to have been sparked by an incident in Rugby in the Midlands, where a 12-year-old girl was prevented from speaking at a school event while wearing a Union Jack themed dress. Now, the theme of the school event was linked to wear something related to your culture, or, sort of a cultural awareness day. So this girl wore a Union Jack dress. So I guess this story might be a little bit confusing for non-UK listeners. So let's sort of briefly explain the history of the adoption of the English flag and then sort of the Union Jack as well, which is the sort of famous British flag. The English flag, so the St. George's Cross, is a red cross on a white background, as said previously. Its association with England dates back to the Middle Ages, while a popular belief credits its adoption to Richard the Lionheart, who was one of the kings of England. This sort of lacks any historical evidence. The Red Cross became England's official symbol sometime between 1348 and 1552. It's sort of not entirely clear. And in 1552, it became the only saint's flag that was permitted to be flown in public. The Union Jack, on the other hand, is the flag of the United Kingdom. So the first version of this was created in 1606 by James I to symbolise the union of the crowns of England and Scotland, combining the St. George's Cross with the white diagonal cross of St. Andrew, and the current design, which includes the red diagonal cross of St. Patrick of Ireland, was adopted in 1801 following the Act of Union with Ireland. It's a common point of discussion that the Welsh flag is never incorporated into it, A, because, it's a really awesome flag in the Welsh flag, there's a dragon on it, but also there's a wider discussion there as it speaks to a debate about Wales often being seen as an extension of England rather than a country in its own right, best epitomised by an infamous entry in the 1883 Encyclopaedia Britannica, which stated, "For Wales, see England," symbolising a historical lack of understanding and recognition of Welsh distinctiveness within a British establishment, within the British state. So the current flag flying campaign has been driven by organised groups, most notably Operation Raise the Colours and a Birmingham-based group called the Weoli Warriors. These groups have explicitly stated their goal is to promote patriotism and express pride in England's history and achievements. The Weoli Warriors state that their mission is a group of proud Englishmen with a common goal to show Birmingham and the rest of the country how proud we are of our history, freedoms, and achievements. Note there it says group of men with a common purpose. Sort of shows you it's going to be quite specific. And they've been successful in raising tens of thousands of pounds through a GoFundMe pages to buy the flags, poles, and cable ties needed for the campaign. This has fueled a fierce ideological clash with local councils, many of which have been taking the flags down. Councils in places like Tower Hamlets and Birmingham cite health and safety concerns, stating the flags can obstruct visibility and are attached to street furniture without permission. The flaggers, in turn, have been reported to put up new banners as quickly as council workers are taking them down, with some supporters describing their actions as sticking two fingers up to the establishment. Again, bit of an English ism there. Sticking two fingers up to the establishment. If you present that gesture, it goes back to the time of Agincourt, the battle between England and France. And the legend has it that the French would chop off the two fingers of the English bowmen because they were very good archers. So again, that's where it comes from. There's also quite an irony with the celebration of St. George from people who are very English and think that everything should stay English, because the flag is used in various contexts. In a historical context, St. George was a Roman soldier born in modern-day Turkey in the 3rd century. However, his mother was from Lydda in the Roman province of Syria, Palestina, now Lod in Israel, where George was later martyred and buried. He's widely venerated in the Middle East, particularly by the Palestinian Christians who consider him a local hero. His significance transcends Christianity. Muslims also revere him, associating him with the figure of Al-Qadir, or the Green One, from the Quran. So for centuries, his tomb in Lydda was a site of pilgrimage for both Christians and Muslims seeking cures and blessings. And the popular legend of him slaying a dragon was only added to his story centuries later. So the historical George was a martyr who died for his Christian faith after refusing to renounce it. The deeper political and social meanings behind this. So the public is deeply divided on the motivations behind the displays. While a significant portion of the public believes it's an act of national pride, others think it's a political statement aimed at immigrants. This polarization is rooted in a long-standing tension within English identity. Academic research highlights that English nationalism, unlike its Scottish or Welsh counterparts, is often perceived as illiberal and regressive. This is partly due to the flag's co-option by the far-right groups since the late 1970s, most notoriously with English skinheads and football hooliganism. For many, the flag has become a symbol of politics of resentment, a reaction to perceived losses of national identity, and a lack of official approval for Englishness by institutions. This sense of feeling left behind is a key component of the flag flying movement. Researchers suggest that a sense of English identity is most strongly felt by anxious and aspirational voters, in the squeezed middle who feel disconnected from politically confident graduate class. And the issue also has a geographical component, with people outside of London and the southeast more likely to identify as English and British. Politicians are now navigating this complex landscape, while Reform UK's Nigel Farage has praised the movement. Even Reform-led councils are grappling with the practicalities, with one in Durham removing flags for safety reasons. Labour leader Keir Starmer and the Prime Minister has publicly backed the display of flags, stating he wants to reclaim the flag for a more inclusive, patriotic vision. There's also a weird interview with him where he says, "I absolutely love flags. I have flags in my house." And the new Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, said something similar. And I just think it's really not patriotic. I think it's idiotic by saying stuff like that. I mean, do they have flags everywhere? You know, I just seems really weird thing to say. But anyway, each to their own. So the flag, so basically Keir Starmer wants it to be more inclusive and patriotic, but this approach has been criticised as being in conflict with the party's traditional base. So the flag, I suppose there's a sort of symbol of shifting identity. This debate also reveals a fundamental shift in how people view their national flag. For centuries, the St. George's Cross was just one of several symbols used by the monarchy. Before the Euro 1996 football tournament, many English people simply regarded the Union Jack or the Union flag as their national flag, so the sort of combination of all of the countries together. The St. George's Cross was often relegated to sporting events. Its current prominence is a modern phenomenon born out of a desire for distinct English identity separate from Britishness. Ultimately, the flags themselves are not just pieces of fabric, they're a site of symbolic contest. They act as a visual shorthand, a way of expressing strong feelings about heritage that is felt to be under threat, whether from immigration, globalization, or a perceived cultural elite. As political commentators have noted, to fully understand the issue, we have to look beyond the simple patriotism versus racism binary and appreciate the deeper anxieties and sense of disconnect that are driving the movement. So yeah, that's flags. Who knew flags could be so complicated?
I think that's so interesting. And I really love the overview that you gave there, because I've just been seeing it a lot on the news and on social media and people talking about the flags as symbols. But I think hearing the lineage and where they came from, it makes a lot of sense. We are going to switch gears a little bit now. And Tom, you mentioned how Reform is kind of claiming this movement with the flags. Reform just had their party conference last week on Friday the 5th and Saturday the 6th of September in Birmingham. So we're going to set the tone by talking about Nigel Farage's speech, because that was a key moment in the conference, and then some of the key moments that we saw in the media and that were shared all over social media. I feel like this was a very covered event, and rightfully so. I think all the party conferences are going to get a lot of coverage, but this one, I saw so many clips from certain moments in the conference. Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the Reform Party, used the conference to emphasize that Reform is a serious contender in future UK elections, saying that there is every chance of a general election being called in 2027. The event included theatrical and attention-grabbing moments. Dame Andrea Jenkins performed her own song, Insomniac, live on stage, which was all over social media, and it drew mixed reactions from the audience and the wider public. There were instances of false or controversial claims. For example, vaccine skeptic voices were given very prominent platforms at the conference. And key policy pledges that were discussed included tight border control, opposition to immigration, particularly irregular immigration via boats, skepticism of the European Convention on Human Rights, and I'm going to mention this a lot, so ECHR for short. They also talked about kind of hinting at major institutional changes, such as transforming the neutrality of the civil service. Farage presented Reform as being very ready for early elections, and that the party is ready to address what they see as the failures of the current government, especially when it comes to law and order, immigration, and trust in institutions. So, thinking about the reactions and the coverage of the event, the Labour Party and the Conservatives have both reacted with concern about what Reform is signaling, and they have talked a lot about how Reform is pushing the UK's political landscape further to the right on immigration and civil rights, and they're concerned about an erosion of established neutral bodies like the civil service, which I mentioned, and more confrontational language in politics, which I think that they've been doing for some time, but this just kind of ramped it up at their party conference. Some of Reform's policy ideas, especially around the neutrality of the civil service and challenging the ECHR, have provoked debates about how realistic and how constitutional these reforms could be, and critics warn of potential impacts on the UK's legal obligations and the norms in the UK. So, thinking about the media coverage, which we, of course, the three of us care a lot about, just based on our backgrounds and the work that we do, the conference drew a mix of theatrical spectacle and serious political content. So, of course, that's going to lead to a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to the media coverage. The conference leaned into performances, as I mentioned, and songs and dramatic entrances and lots of bold statements. So, a lot of the conference was staged with the intention of energizing supporters and generating lots of media coverage, which I don't think is a surprise based on past reform content and past statements that have been made by Nigel Farage in particular. But critics have raised that the theatrics of the conference may have overshadowed the policy discussions that were supposed to be happening there. And there's also been scrutiny of how balanced the coverage was and whether reform has been given a media platform without the sufficient challenges that need to be done about the accuracy of some of their statements, especially when it comes to those vaccine skeptic speakers that I mentioned and claims about immigration and international treaties. So, taking a step back, I want to think about what the Reform Conference means for politics in the UK in a wider sense, because it was jam-packed with lots to unpack, but I'm going to break this down into 4 points, and if I miss anything, you guys add on at the end. But the first is reform and the conference's impact on the shifting political agenda in the UK. I mentioned that reform's ideas are kind of pulling the political climate further right in a lot of respects. So even if the party isn't in control of a huge number of seats right now, their influence has already been shifting the positions of other parties as they try to respond to this rising support for reform. So that's going to impact all of the parties, especially as we get closer to elections in 2026. The second is recent polling and what that polling could mean for future elections. Polling suggests that in local areas, reform is gaining support and they're being taken much more seriously by the public. If public dissatisfaction with Labour and or the Conservatives continues, particularly around immigration, cost of living, trust in institutions, reform may be in a very strong position to be successful in the 2026 elections. The third is that the party conference was a test of political branding and credibility after reform had success in the 2025 local elections across the UK. So I think that this was a moment for them to come out strong and show that they had been so successful in the local elections. And there was lots of dramatic performances and publicity stunts. But with those performances and stunts come risk, because as you're adding in theatrical elements and controversial statements, there's also going to be accusations of misinformation or extremism, and that leads to backlash. So reform's credibility will definitely depend on how coherent and grounded their policy proposals are moving forward towards those local elections and how well they can avoid being dismissed as a populist spectacle, which I think a lot of people have raised when it comes to reform and the performance that was their party conference. But the fourth point that I want to raise is the potential impact that reform could have on Labour and Conservatives. And I mentioned this a little bit, but for the Labour Party, which is the party in power right now, the emergence of reform as a more visible and vocal challenger could force policy shifts, especially around immigration, free speech, and how to approach ECHR or human rights frameworks. It could keep making them shift to the right, which we've actually already seen. But the Reform Conference caused some ripples, and for now, especially as we wait on the other party conferences, it leaves me with a lot of questions and things to watch, especially as we get closer to the 2026 elections across the UK, which I know we've talked about in past episodes. But with that overview, Sid and Tom, did I leave anything out? Was there anything that you guys picked up on that I didn't mention? What were some of the key moments that you guys were watching from the Reform Conference?
I thought that was a brilliant analysis, Lily. I don't think you really missed out anything from a policy or a political sort of narrative analysis or the impact that the reform is trying to have on other parties at this point in time, and kind of downplaying their structures because they clearly are I mean, Nigel Farage clearly stated that he gives a damn about traditions. And we're not going to be following traditions and all of that. So I think brilliant analysis. Couldn't have put it better. What I would definitely like to add on to this is just Nigel Farage's ability to hold a speech together. I thought that was ridiculous. I thought he missed so many cues, so many points where, he should have said the line in a different way, just from a purely analytical standpoint. The crowd's reaction was kind of mistimed to what he was trying to say. And there were lots of points where he was looking for like a response briefly, very like a split second sort of a thing. And yet he was kind of not kind of delivering the punch that he needed to do. So A, he needs to read his speeches better. B, he needs a better speechwriter. C, I think he's really trying to play on to the whole thing that, Keir Starmer's cabinet is in shambles at this point in time. And that the existing structures are failing despite people being very experienced in being in government and being, legislators for a time being. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting time period to see how the Labour Party responds to all of this. There are major things that are going to be happening very soon. Trump's state visit, which I'm going to be kind of briefly mentioning in my section as well. But yeah, fantastic analysis, Lily.
Yeah, I'd agree as well. Really comprehensive. I guess the couple of things I would add on to what both you guys have said is there was an interview that Nigel Farage did. I don't know if it might have been with ITV News, and he sort of admitted that they need a lot more talent in the party, and particularly people with governing experience. And there's a lot of speculation of who might be joining that. Someone you mentioned earlier, Dame Andrea Jenkins, she's got a fair amount of political experience. Sir Jake Berry, who was actually Liz Truss's chair of the Conservative Party for a brief spell, 6 weeks or however long it was. And there's been some councillors that have switched over, and some conservative MS has recently joined the party as well, or converted over to Reform. So I think that's one of their challenges, is that to avoid being a one-person show, they've got to try and attract more people. Now, no doubt, knowing Nigel Farage's ability to perform and, as a media operator, I'm sure he's got a whole list of people that are going to be coming over in dribs and drabs over time. So I wouldn't be surprised if some bigger names who are sort of more eye-catching will appear. I did see that Jacob Rees-Mogg was at the Reform conference, but he firmly said that he is still a Conservative and a very loyal Conservative. But yeah, it would be interesting to see how tempted people are to join the other side. Also, there was some research done by an organisation called B Broadcast's Mission Control, with Cast from Clay, who are the political comms experts, about the representation of the political parties in the media. And this was released on the 5th of September. Out in front by a significant distance in terms of media mentions in broadcasting, so TV and radio, Labour was way ahead with nearly 1 million mentions. The Conservatives, for that matter, in a period, I think it was the beginning of January 2025 to the beginning of September 2025, their mentions were about 121,000, so a fraction of Labour. And Reform had about 353,000 mentions, so significantly more than the Conservatives, bearing in mind that the Conservatives have about 120 MPs and Reform only have 4. So there is a significant overrepresentation of Reform in that context. And then in comparison, the Lib Dems were only mentioned 46,000 times, or just over 46,000 times, and they have 72 MPs. So their media representation has been pretty poor. But yeah, they were my additions there.
Thanks, Tom. That was pretty clinical, I would say, very statistics oriented and really vital, all of those. Now let's move on to the cabinet reshuffle that everybody's talking about. I'd like to call it Starmer's kerfuffle. That's pretty much become a political nightmare for the Labour Party at this point in time. So what has happened? Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner resigned on September 5th after underpaying £40,000 in stamp duty on an £800,000 flat. Ethics advisor Sir Laurie Magnus found she breached ministerial code by ignoring her solicitor's advice to seek specialist tax guidance. So what's the killer irony? Rayner built her career attacking Tories over tax scandals. She slammed Jeremy Hunt for stamp duty arrangements and demanded Nadeem Zahawi's resignation as well. So this is basically political karma at its finest and political hypocrisy, I would call it. So Rayner's exit triggered the biggest reshuffle of Starmer's premiership so far, which is just about a year old at this point in time. Half of the cabinet changed jobs or has left entirely at this point in time. So David Lammy jumped from Foreign Secretary to Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. Yvette Cooper, as Tom mentioned before, moved from being Home Secretary to Foreign Secretary. Shabana Mahmood shifted to Home Secretary. And the Telegraph actually reports that she'll take a much tougher line on immigration than Cooper. So this is like a historic first where 3 of the 4 grade offices are now held by women, which I guess it's a purely political move by the Labour Party. And the casualties include Ian Murray as Scotland Secretary and Lucy Powell as the Commons leader. The worst timing possible, this has happened during Reform's Birmingham conference, where Nigel Farage moved his speech forward 3 hours to capitalize on the Labour's chaos, which is a very smart move by him, by the way. But there's more. So on Thursday, September 11th, which is yesterday, Starmer fired Peter Mandelson as the United States ambassador over Jeffrey Epstein links. US lawmakers released Epstein's 2003 birthday book showing Mandelson called him my best pal. And then Bloomberg published emails where Mandelson told Epstein, I think the world of you, and advised him to fight for early release after his 2008 conviction. Disgusting. The Foreign Office said this showed Mandelson's relationship was materially different from that known at the time of his appointment, especially when just 24 hours earlier, Starmer defended Mandelson in the parliament and, clearly knowing what was going to happen next, opposition leader Kemi Badenoch said Starmer has no backbone and deterred when he needed to be decisive. Interestingly, this is Mandelson's 3rd forced resignation from government roles. He's previously resigned in 1998 over an undeclared loan of over £300,000 from cabinet colleague Geoffrey Robinson, and then again in 2001 over accusations of influencing a passport application for an Indian businessman, Srichand Hinduja, who's now a British businessman. So these twin disasters expose serious judgment problems. The Institute for Government warns moving so many ministers is unavoidably introduces uncertainty and disruption. The 2 great offices have new occupants mid-crisis, and meanwhile, Reform UK has won 677 seats in local elections and now leads Labour in some polls, a staggering reversal from last year's landslide victory that Keir Starmer achieved. The New Statesman calls this a clear rightward shift as Labour abandons its left to chase Reform voters. For me personally, I think when the left starts chasing or doing certain things which the right is doing, it's like legitimizing everything what the right's been doing. And that just is a bad political move, because then it gives it just makes a lot of people veer towards the right a lot more and says, oh, he was doing that. Now he's also doing this. Maybe he did it first. So, he was doing the right thing at the first time. So it just complicates and dirties the political waters a lot more. Structural changes also include Darren Jones as the new chief secretary to the prime minister, designed to improve Downing Street and Treasury coordination, which seems very odd that suddenly you need a role like this. So internally, the Labour Party is experiencing a lot of damage because of this reshuffle, and it has also strained a lot of relationships within the party as well. Kai Anuvra complained about having higher standards for working class ministers, especially women. The pattern is concerning because Roshanara's Ali's resignation over landlord practices, Rayner's tax issues suggesting systemic problems with vetting and standards, and Rayner's departure triggers a deputy leadership election as well, reopening party divisions. The Labour Party is definitely in a soup at this point in time. And now, of course, as mentioned earlier, you had reforms conference, but the next big things that are coming up are Labour's conference and the crucial budget that's going to be happening in November. So capitalizing on this, Farage told reform activists to expect elections within the next 2 years and announced a government preparation department. Now, he's probably jumping the gun at this point in time, but he's going to milk this crisis as much as possible. Internationally, I think if we look at it just from a diplomatic point of view and not the scandal point of view, I think Mandelson's firing is going to be devastating for the US-UK relations because his trade expertise was crucial for preventing Trump's tariffs to keeping it minimum. And he built rapport with Trump and even visiting the Oval Office in May. Ironically, both of them are there in the Epstein files at this point in time. So it's not a big surprise that they were able to kind of form a relationship there. However, what it brings out in all of this is the vetting failure that is really embarrassing for both the United States as well as for the UK government. Ro Khanna, who is a US Democrat, praised the firing, saying rich and powerful men who covered for Epstein must be held accountable. But everybody knows that this is like a reactive kind of a thing due to poor vetting or negligence, one could say. The interim replacement, James Roscoe, faces now a pretty uphill battle in setting the relations right again and trying to figure out that there's no additional pushback on tariffs by the United States because it is that unpredictable. And the broader pattern that we're looking at right now is that both scandals have involved information that have been caught, like I would have caught it. It's that basic that they should have been caught during proper vetting. And Rayner's tax complexity was known, and security services did flag Mandelson's concerns, but according to sources, they say that they were kind of ignored at that point in time, or they were deflayed by Starmer's office. So the bottom line is that this is entirely self-inflicted damage. A government that won a landslide 14 months ago now trails a party, most in terms of influence at least, a party that most voters are only hearing of right now. And Starmer faces multiple tests. There's Trump's state visit that's going to be happening soon. There's the party conference and the budget, as I mentioned earlier. So whether this is going to be like a temporary crisis or a historical inflection point that a Labour Party that has over 400 seats is struggling to run a government despite having a full majority is something which we're going to have to see. And analysts will love to sort of cover this sort of situation. So yeah, that's if there's something which Lily and Tom would like to add to this whole discussion, I would be very happy to hear.
No, yeah. Who's the new guy that's been appointed to replace Mandelson, or is it only like a temporary fix, Sid?
It's a temporary thing.
Oh, yeah, good. Interesting to see who they pick next, because I can't remember who was in the mix before. David Miliband was one of the people being touted, although I don't know what his relationship is with the. So when the possibility of Mandelson being appointed, there were rumours about David Miliband being brought in. David Miliband being the former foreign secretary between 2007 2010, and who is now, or has been for many years, probably about 10 years, the CEO of International Rescue Committee, which is a big NGO. Yeah, David Miliband lives in New York, strong connections in America, but I don't know whether he's too liberal for Trump. Mandelson is someone who, well, his nickname was the Prince of Darkness because of his ability to spin a lot of things. He's credited with creating New Labour with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, backed Tony Blair in the leadership race in 1994 after spending the 1980s, very fallow period in Labour history, trying to get Labour into government, and eventually got there. But, has let down a lot of the people that sort of have entrusted him with responsibility. And I was quite surprised of his return. He had a sort of political comeback at the end of the Labour years, around the time of the financial crash, and he became the business secretary and was made a Lord. And he'd also had a period, sort of run in Europe as well, as a European commissioner. So yeah, I was a little bit surprised his return. He also unsuccessfully ran to be the Chancellor of the Oxford University, losing out to William Hague, Lord Hague. So yeah, I don't know what his appointment meant. I don't know what it was meant to represent beyond his relationship with Trump. It shows that there's sort of quite a dominant sort of New Labour, Blairites sort of control in the Labour Party at the moment, and whether Mandelson going there, whether that changes in a more sort of permanent appointment, I'm not sure.
Well, we'll have to stay tuned. There's lots more to come. I feel like a lot of this stuff that you mentioned, Sid, is only just getting started, and with all the party conferences right around the corner, there's going to be lots more British news to cover, maybe another British political dispatch in our future. We'll see. All right, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Political Dispatch after a few busy weeks in British politics.
You can find us wherever you found this episode. Please like, subscribe, and share our show so we can continue to reach more people and drive up interest in these vital conversations. My name is Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Mott.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. You've been listening to the Political Dispatch.